It is only fair to Sara Lee to say that she shared in neither quality. She was far from ugly, and very, very far from rich. She had started her part with a full stage to carry on the figure, but one by one they had gone away into the wings, and had not come back. At 19, she was alone, knitting by the fire, with no idea whatever that the backdrop was a painted net, and that beyond it, waiting for its moment, was the forest of adventure. A strange forest, too, one that Sara Lee would not have recognized as a forest. And a prince, of course, but a prince as strange and mysterious as the forest. The end of December 1914 found Sara Lee quite contented. If it was resignation rather than content, no one but Sara Lee knew the difference. Knitting, too, but not for soldiers. She was, to be candid, knitting an afghan against an interesting event which involved a friend of hers. Sara Lee rather deplored the event, in her own mind, of course, for in her small circle young unmarried women accepted the major events of life without question, and certainly without conversation. She never, for instance, allowed her Uncle James, with whom she lived, to see her working at the afghan, and even her Aunt Harriet had supposed it to be a sweater until it assumed uncompromising proportions. Sara Lee's days, up to the 20th of December 1914, had been much alike. In the mornings, she straightened up her room, which she had copied from one in a woman's magazine, with the result that it gave somehow the impression of a baby's bassinet, being largely dotted Swiss and ribbon. Yet, in a way, it was a perfect setting for Sara Lee herself. It was fresh and virginal and very, very neat and white. A resigned little room, like Sara Lee, resigned to be tucked away in a corner and to have no particular outlook. Peaceful, too. Sometimes in the morning, between straightening her room and going to the market for Aunt Harriet, Sara Lee looked at a newspaper, so she knew there was a war. She read the headings, and when the matter came up for mention at the little afternoon bridge club, as it did now and then after the prizes were distributed, she always said, "Isn't it horrible?" and changed the subject. On the night of the 19th of December, Sara Lee had read her chapter in the Bible, she read it through once each year, and had braided down her hair, which was as smooth and shining and lovely as Sara Lee herself, and had raised her window for the night, when Aunt Harriet came in. Sara Lee did not know at first that she had a visitor. She stood looking out toward the east, until Aunt Harriet touched her on the arm. "What in the world?" said Aunt Harriet. "A body would suppose it was August." "I was just thinking," said Sara Lee. "You'd better do your thinking in bed. Jump in and I'll put out your light." So Sara Lee got into her white bed with the dotted Swiss valance and drew the covers to her chin and looked a scant 16. Aunt Harriet, who was an unsentimental woman, childless and diffident, found her suddenly very appealing there in her smooth bed, and did an unexpected thing. She kissed her. Then, feeling extremely uncomfortable, she put out the light and went to the door. There she paused. "Thinking," she said. "What about, Sara Lee?" Perhaps it was because the light was out that Sara Lee became articulate. Perhaps it was because things that had been forming in her young mind for weeks had at last crystallized into words. Perhaps it was because of a picture she had happened on that day of a boy lying wounded somewhere on a battlefield and calling, "Mother." "About over there," she said rather hesitatingly. "And about Anna." "Over there?" "The war," said Sara Lee. "I was just thinking about all those women over there, like Anna, you know. They had babies and got everything ready for them, and then the babies grew up, and they're all getting killed." "It's horrible," said Aunt Harriet. "Do you want another blanket? It's cold tonight." Sara Lee did not wish another blanket. "I'm a little worried about your Uncle James," said Aunt Harriet at the door. "He's got indigestion. I think I'll make him a mustard plaster." She prepared to go out then, but Sara Lee spoke from her white bed. "Aunt Harriet," she said, "I don't think I'll ever get married." "I said that once, too," said Aunt Harriet complacently. "What's got into your head now?" "I don't know. Sara Lee replied vaguely. What's the use? Aunt Harriet was conscious of a hazy impression of indelicacy. Coming from Sara Lee, it was startling and revolutionary. In Aunt Harriet's world, young women did not question their duty, which was to marry, preferably someone in the neighborhood, and bear children, who would be wheeled about that same neighborhood in perambulators, and who would ultimately grow up and look after themselves. "The use?" she asked tartly. "Of having babies, and getting to care about them, and then there will always be wars, won't there?" "You turn over and go to sleep," counseled Aunt Harriet, "and stop looking 20 years or more ahead." She hesitated. "You haven't quarreled with Harvey, have you?" Sara Lee turned over obediently. "No, it's not that," she said, and the door closed. Perhaps, had she ever had time during the crowded months that followed, Sara Lee would have dated certain things from that cold, frosty night in December when she began to question things. For after all, that was what it came to. She did not revolt. She questioned. She lay in her white bed and looked at things for the first time. The sky had seemed low that night. Things were nearer. The horizon was close. And beyond that peaceful horizon to the east, something was going on that could not be ignored. Men were dying, killing and dying. Men who had been waited for as Anna watched for her child. Downstairs she could hear Aunt Harriet moving about. The street was quiet, until a crowd of young people, she knew them by their voices, went by laughing. "It's horrible," said Sara Lee to herself. There was a change in her, but she was still inarticulate. Somewhere in her mind, but not formulated, was the feeling that she was too comfortable. Her peace was a cheap peace, bought at no price. Her last waking determination was to finish the Afghan quickly and to knit for the men at the war. Uncle James was ill the next morning. Sara Lee went for the doctor, but Anna's hour had come, and he was with her. Late in the afternoon he came, however, looking a bit gray round the mouth with fatigue, but triumphant. He had on these occasions always a sense of victory, even, in a way, a feeling of being part of a great purpose. He talked at such times of the race, as one may who is doing his best by it. "Well," he said when Sara Lee opened the door, "it's a boy, 8 pounds, going to be red-headed, too." He chuckled. "A boy?" said Sara Lee. Don't you bring any girl babies any more?" The doctor put down his hat and glanced at her. "Wanted a girl to be named for you?" "No, it's not that. It's only—" She checked herself. He wouldn't understand. The race required girl babies. "I've put a blue bow on my Afghan. Pink is for boys," she said, and led the way upstairs. Very simple and orderly was the small house, as simple and orderly as Sara Lee's days in it. Time was to come when Sara Lee, having left it, ached for it with every fiber of her body and her soul, for its bright curtains and fresh paint, its regularity, its shining brasses and growing plants, its very kitchen pans and green and white oilcloth. She was to ache, too, for her friends, their small engrossing cares, their kindly interest, their familiar faces. Time was to come, too, when she came back, not to the little house, it is true, but to her friends, to Anna and the others. But they had not grown, and Sara Lee had, and that is the story. Uncle James died the next day. One moment he was there, an uneasy figure under the tulip quilt, and the next he had gone away entirely, leaving a terrible quiet behind him. He had been the center of the little house, a big and cheery and not over-orderly center. Followed his going not only quiet, but a wretched tidiness. There was nothing for Sara Lee to do but to think. And, in the way of mourning women, things that Uncle James had said which had passed unheeded came back to her. One of them was when he had proposed to adopt a Belgian child, and Aunt Harriet had offered horrified protest. "All right," he had said. "Of course, if you feel that way about it. but I feel kind of mean sometimes sitting here doing nothing when there's such a lot to be done." Then he had gone for a walk and had come back cheerful enough, but rather quiet. There was that other time, too, when the German army was hurling itself wave after wave across the Yser, only, of course, Sara Lee knew nothing of the Yser then, and when it seemed as though the attenuated Allied line must surely crack and give. He had said then that if he were only 20 years younger, he would go across and help. "And what about me?" Aunt Harriet had asked. "But I suppose I wouldn't matter." "You could go to Jenny's, couldn't you?" There had followed one of those absurd wrangles as to whether or not Aunt Harriet would go to Jenny's in the rather remote contingency of Uncle James becoming 20 years younger and going away. And now Uncle James had taken on the wings of the morning and was indeed gone away. And again it became a question of Jenny's. Aunt Harriet, rather dazed at first, took to arguing it pro and con. "Of course she has room for me," she would say in her thin voice. "There's that little room that was Edgar's. There's nobody in it now, but there's only room for a single bed, Sara Lee." Sara Lee was knitting socks now, all a trifle tight as to heel. "I know," she would say. "I'll get along, don't you worry about me." Always these talks ended on a note of exasperation for Aunt Harriet, for Sara Lee's statement that she could manage would draw forth a plaintive burst from the older woman. "If only you'd marry Harvey," she would say. "I don't know what's come over you. You used to like him well enough." "I still like him." "I've seen you jump when the telephone bell rang. Your Uncle James often spoke about it. He noticed more than most people thought." She followed Sara Lee's eyes down the street to where Anna was wheeling her baby, slowly up and down. Even from that distance, Sara Lee could see the bit of pink, which was the bow on her afghan. "I believe you're afraid." "Afraid?" "Of having children," accused Aunt Harriet fretfully. Sara Lee colored. "Perhaps I am," she said, "but not the sort of thing you think. I just don't see the use of it, that's all. Aunt Harriet, how long does it take to become a hospital nurse?" "Mabel Andrews was 3 years. It spoiled her looks, too. She used to be a right pretty girl." 3 years, Sara Lee reflected. By that time... The house was very quiet and still those days. There was an interlude of emptiness and order, of long days during which Aunt Harriet alternately grieved and planned, and Sara Lee thought of many things. At the Red Cross meetings all sorts of stories were circulated. The Belgian atrocity tales had just reached the country and were spreading like wildfire. There were arguments and disagreements. A girl named Schmidt was militant against them, and soon found herself a small island of defiance entirely surrounded by disapproval. Mabel Andrews came once to a meeting, and in businesslike fashion explained the Red Cross dressings and gave a lesson in bandaging. Forerunner of the many first-aid classes to come was that hour of Mabel's, and made memorable by one thing she said. "You might as well all get busy and learn to do such things," she stated in her brisk voice. "One of our interns is over there, and he says we'll be in it before spring." After the meeting, Sara Lee went up to Mabel and put a hand on her arm. "Are you going?" she asked. "Leaving day after tomorrow. Why?" Couldn't I be useful over there?" Mabel smiled rather grimly. "What can you do?" "I can cook." "Only men cooks, my dear. What else?" "I could clean up, couldn't I? There must be something. I'd do anything I could. Don't they have people to wash dishes and all that?" Mabel was on doubtful ground there. She knew of a woman who had been permitted to take over her own automobile, paying all her expenses and buying her own tires and gasoline. "She carries supplies to small hospitals in out-of-the-way places," she said. "But I don't suppose you can do that, Sara Lee, can you?" However, she gave Sara Lee a New York address, and Sara Lee wrote and offered herself. She said nothing to Aunt Harriet, who had by that time elected to take Edgar's room at Cousin Jenny's, and was putting Uncle James' clothes in tearful order to send to Belgium. After a time, she received a reply. "We have put your name on our list of volunteers," said the letter. "But of course you understand that only trained workers are needed now. France and England are full of untrained women who are eager to help." It was that night that Sarah